Ethical Reform for the Democratic Republic of the Congo's Mining Industry by Wilder Stark. Cobalt and coltan are now among the crucial raw materials driving technological advancements today that fuel common devices such as smartphones and electric cars. With global consumption on the rise, the regions that supply these materials are under increasing strain, especially in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. In the DRC, the workers who extract these materials are often met with incredibly dangerous working conditions. Over 70% of the world's cobalt is sourced from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and it's mined from 255,000 Congolese people, 40,000 of those being children. According to the International Trade Administration, despite ongoing conflict in the east of the country, the potential for political instability and unstable commodity prices, mine operations continue to invest in anticipation of improved market conditions. The persistence in production shows how dependent the DRC is to the Congolese workforce and may even be looking at ethical concerns. With the reforms initiated by Minister Louis Vuitton Kabamba, the realities of cobalt and coltan extraction continue to exploit and expose workers to harmful conditions. Creating a secure and accountable mining industry requires the Minister of Mines to enforce transparent mining practices, extensive labor regulations, and enforcement methods to ensure all those regulations are met. Implementing these methods could ensure the DRC can defend their workers while also promoting sustainable and responsible development. Mining is one of the Democratic Republic of the Congo's main economic foundations, and it is incredibly important for economic profits and development opportunities. Cobalt and coltan are in high demand because they are needed for electronics and clean energy technologies. When that demand grows, it directly affects the DRC's economy. A statement from the Delve database claimed copper and cobalt miners have an average daily income of $7, although 40% of the miners earn less than the Congolese legal daily minimum of $4. These figures demonstrate how unstable and minuscule miners' incomes are, even in a sector that is considered vital to the DRC. Over time, the government has focused on maximizing output to support economic growth for their country, but without prioritizing the improvement of working conditions, it could affect national development and stability. In an academic chapter written by Roy McIntosh, he explained that some of the heavily mined regions of Africa often experience underdevelopment, corruption, political instability, and in some cases, violent conflict. However, the chapter also illustrated Africa's rich mineral resources and how vital it is to their economy. Artisanal small mines, also known as ASMs, are where issues such as child labor, dangerous working conditions, and environmental impacts mainly occur, and focus on labor regulations and enforcement could be economically strategic for the DRC. According to the Ministry of Mines website, their objectives include implementing the government's program on mining legislation, developing geological maps and promoting resources, monitoring and controlling controls of mining in the DRC, and implementing the government's program on mining legislation. The Minister of Mines, Louis Vuitton Kabamba, has recently made efforts to better cooperate with Chinese companies, but the visit was mainly centered around localizing the production of these materials and sustainable development. To better the DRC's economic growth, the Ministry of Mines should shift their focus to bettering working conditions and enforcing stricter regulations regarding large-scale mining and also artisanal small-scale mines. This would help grow the DRC's economy because they would be known as a responsible exporter of raw materials, which appeals to consumers and investors. Strengthening labor protections, especially in ASMs, aligns with the minister's values of sustainable development, while also fostering an ethical and responsible economic foundation to expand on. Reports and eyewitness accounts have sparked interest around the world, making it clear that the cobalt and coltan miners in the DRC are facing terrible working conditions. Journalistic and research accounts from Terry Gross's NPR episode stated that workers were mining in deep pits and tunnels with hand tools, often facing cave-ins, respiratory sickness, and long hours with very little pay, which unfortunately were repeated patterns found in global reporting. The episode featured Siddharth Kara, who has been researching these conditions for over 20 years, who stated cobalt is too toxic to touch and breathe, and there are hundreds and thousands of Congolese people touching and breathing it in and day out. Young mothers with babies strapped to their backs, all breathing in this toxic cobalt dust. According to this report, the social damage and environmental degradation is caused by the illicit operations tied to weak enforcement and foreign participation. These working conditions directly affect the country's most profitable export market, and enforcing labor regulations protects the sector, keeping the DRC's economy afloat. These regulations would strengthen the DRC's global reputation, reduce political instability, increase productivity, all while meeting the minister's commitments. According to the International Labor Organization, economic development should include the creation of jobs and working conditions in which people can work in freedom, safety, and dignity. If the Ministry of Mines addresses these issues, it would not only help vulnerable workers, but also the DRC's international image, which could, in turn, help credibility with investors. A report by the Wilson Center, a human rights organization, claimed that around 40,000 children worked in these mines, some even as young as 7 years old, using only manual tools. With routine exposure to toxic dust and no protective gear, these workers find themselves in an increasingly dangerous workforce. An analysis done by Amani Mataboro Tom provided eye-opening information on the violence and corruption happening in the DRC, such as the 450 illegal Chinese-ran companies operating without permits found in July of 2024. The analysis also stated that in territories with mining operations, the rate of severe malnutrition among children under 5 years old is high. Many children are out of school, there is an unbearable degradation of water systems, and the rainforest is being washed out. Confronting and fixing these abuses is necessary for the DRC to demonstrate responsible mineral governance, showing that economic and technological growth doesn't have to come at the expense of human rights. To address these issues, the Ministry of Mines should enforce clearer labor standards for international and artisanal small mines, provide trained inspectors to regulate ASMs, require mining companies to provide protective gear and healthcare, and restrict mining zone access to those over 16. The environmental toll of raw material extraction has become another obstacle that the Ministry of Mines must overcome to responsibly attain sustainable development. In a study done by the Global Forest Coalition, they found that since 2000, the DRC has lost 8.6% of its forest cover, and mining was the main cause. Mining operations also frequently contaminate rivers with chemical runoffs, which then pollute fishing grounds and water supplies. Charlotte Davies' analysis of mining pollution in the Congo explained how uncontrolled waste can degrade soil quality, reduce biodiversity, and destroy landscapes that local families rely on for farming, meaning that this pollution doesn't just poison water, but threatens food security and everything the ministry is working to uplift. In many regions, the deforestation and soil erosion from open pit excavating have destroyed the natural shields that kept ecosystems balanced, while chemical runoff and dust reduce biodiversity at the same time. The damage also extends into future generations by eroding natural resources that the DRC's communities rely on. As fertile soils are stripped away and forests are cleared, younger generations lose access to farmland that once supported their families, ultimately meaning that the children, who may not be directly involved in mining, have to inherit fewer economic opportunities and are left with fewer ways to support themselves. These ecological harms tie right into human health risks. The dust created from the mining creates a hazy atmosphere for many places in the DRC. Charlotte Davie explains some of the side effects in her claim. Studies have shown that the risk of birth defects such as limb abnormalities or spina bifida greatly increase when a parent worked in a cobalt mine, linked to high levels of toxic pollution caused by the extraction of cobalt. The effects of this pollution also negatively impact breast milk production, which then harms future generations. When these rural residents lose access to clean water and fertile land, the consequences extend beyond the mine itself. They can amplify poverty and force some residents to work in these unmonitored mines for extra income. Without stronger environmental safeguards, the DRC's mining practices risk food scarcity, poor health, and unsustainable livelihoods for the future Congolese generations, which undermines everything the DRC's government is trying to develop. These safeguards could include new regulations regarding contaminated water and dumping policies, mandatory environmental impact assessments before expansions, dust reduction technology, or low-impact excavation tools which would help environmental impacts and the safety of miners. Caring for the environment ultimately means caring for the communities who live near these mines, and without more effective governments, the well-being of these Congolese citizens continues to be at risk. To To address the ongoing abuses tied to cobalt and coltan extraction, the DRC will have to put real weight behind new reforms. This means enforcing completely transparent mining practices, more extensive labor regulations regarding child labor and fair wages, and enforcement methods to make sure that these reforms are taking place. A major step the Ministry of Mines can take is enforcing clearer labor regulations for both industrial and artisanal mining areas. The International Labor Organization reported that countries with consistent inspections, mandatory safety equipment, and legally enforced work contracts saw significant reductions in workplace violations and injuries. If the DRC would apply these methods, they could reduce tunnel collapses, toxic exposure, and the critical safety hazards these miners face. A second solution to remedy these issues is to formalize artisanal mining zones, which remain the most dangerous and least regulated mines. The German Federal Institute for Geosciences and Natural Resources claimed that designated ASM zones that were equipped with stabilized tunnels, proper ventilation, and community-level monitoring had dramatically improved safety and productivity. Creating regulated mining zones in cobalt-rich regions would provide miners with legal safeguards while also helping the DRC regain authority over areas that had previously been influenced by informal groups. Transparency is another key solution to the Democratic Republic of the Congo's plan to build an ethical and economically stable mining industry. According to a due diligence guide released by OECD, it highlighted that tracking supply chains reduces child labor, limits corruption, and increases foreign investment because international investors or buyers can trace labor conditions and mineral origins. The Ministry of Mines ought to expand its public reporting inspections and enhance mineral traceability mechanisms to reduce international criticism and strengthen global credibility in Congolese minerals. These suggestions also support Minister Luis Kabamba's declared goals to strengthen cooperation with foreign partners and develop a modernized, dependable mining industry. In his recent meeting with Zijin Mining, he mentioned the importance of sustainable local transformation and better technical standards. If the Ministry of Mines prioritizes enhancing labor conditions, it would directly support those objectives by demonstrating the DRC's dedication to manufacturing, management, and ethical governance. In the end, lasting reforms should focus on the health and welfare of miners and their families. Contact with dust and hazardous metals exposes miners to risks of respiratory problems and other long-term health issues. Improving access to medical care, providing training for safer extraction, and offering emergency equipment at the mining sites helps reduce harm and protect the country's workforce. These changes wouldn't just help the problems happening right now, they would help the DRC develop a mining sector that treats people fairly while fostering economic growth. Enforcing transparency, improving labor regulations, and expanding formal protections for miners allows the DRC to begin to construct a mining industry in a healthier, more sustainable way.